Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar. The $500 million question: is your donor experience helping you to build your base? We're going to get started in just a few moments' time. For now, why don't you drop us a note in the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from today. And also, if you are on a June 30th fiscal year end, I'd love to hear from you to how things have been this year. Tell us the good, the bad, the beautiful. Are you up, down, donors, dollars, things like that? I'd love to hear from you, and we'll get started with the webinar in just a moment's time. Hello, Jessica. How are you? It's nice to hear from you. Hope to chat with you more soon. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to show up on video so you can all see me. I'm really excited to be here today and then present this webinar and talk through some of our ideas around donor experience. Before we jump in to the topic, we'll have a couple of housekeeping questions. The presentation today is the $500 million question. Is your donor experience helping to build your base? It's a big question. It's a bit of a mouthful. It's an even bigger topic. It's something that I've been talking about at various conferences over the last year or so. It evolves each time we give this presentation. So there's some new stuff in here as well today, but we're going to be talking about a white paper that we published a few weeks ago that got a lot of buzz on the internet, and talk about some of our findings there. And then we're going to talk about what you do about that. How do you create that donor experience that really drives loyalty? Let's have a few housekeeping announcements. If you have questions, please submit those in the Q&A. I'll be doing my best to keep track of that as we go. I will have to answer some sort of throughout the webinar, and others I'll get to at the end. And then also, if you would like to see the recording, you may have colleagues that are looking for that. We'll be sending that out within 24 hours. Mary Kay from Center College, hello. It's really nice to, I wish I could see faces. That's always the thing about webinars. It's very one directional. Everyone's looking at you and you're talking and they're not able to say anything back. But it's really nice seeing names in the chat of people you worked with 15 years ago. So hi, Mary Kay. Anyway, after the webinar, please tell us in a survey that we'll send out how we did. It's always helpful to get feedback from people, things that you liked, things that you didn't like. And most importantly of all, perhaps tell us things that you'd like to be topics for future webinars, because that's really helpful. This is a picture of my face. I am your presenter today, James Barnard. I'm an Associate Managing Vice President at BWF. I lead our annual giving and digital marketing team, which is part of our engagement and donor experience division. I'll tell you a bit more about BWF a little later on today, but you know, I've been with the company for about 3 years, and before that, I led annual giving and marketing teams in mostly higher education and healthcare for about 15 years. Worked at a few different schools of different shapes and sizes, and since joining the company, really had the opportunity to work with all kinds of different organizations, big, small, national nonprofits, large healthcare organizations. Our clients have often come to us with the most complex problems for us to solve, which is always a learning experience for us, and hopefully we teach them something along the way as well. So let's talk about the white paper. We published this a few weeks ago. This is something we've been working on internally for months, actually, quite a long time. I would say it's always been a topic in the annual giving sector of, we've always liked the idea that annual giving is driving the pipeline. It is fueling the pipeline, we often say. The question we really set out to answer was, if that's true, can we quantify it? Can we kind of quantify how much base level giving leads to major giving? And is it truly the pipeline that we think it is? So we had a data set that had 12 colleges and universities, combination of large and small, private and public. This is a somewhat higher ed centric study because all of the data came from higher education, but the findings here really speak to the sector at large. There's some nuance, of course, to the donors who give to different types of organizations, but I think what we can see here is something that spans beyond just higher education. We had 12,757 individuals who had made a gift, first-time gift to the institution under $1,000. And what we did is track their giving over time, and they had gone on to give $25,000 or more in a single transaction. So we tracked their giving over time. And what we found is we looked at the average lifetime giving, gift count, and lifetime giving. And we found that, first of all, the average that each individual made was 42 gifts each. This took place in a 26-year period of time. So several decades were spanning there. And per institution, the dollars given from this group was $449 million. So that's where the idea of the $500 million question comes from. And it's not like there was one outlier in this group. You can kind of see it there in the data. Certainly, the size of the institution is going to affect this to a certain extent. But across the board, we really were seeing that people who were starting their giving journey at the sort of base level under $1,000, those individuals contributed nearly $400,000 in their lifetimes so far. So they started their journey as base level donors and really grew from there. I love this white paper. I think really proud of the work we did here. Collaborated with my colleague Andy Schultz to write this. He's one of our data scientists at BWF. It really is helpful to start actually having some proof behind the ideas we've always thought, that the work we do in annual giving is so important. There's one little quote from the study that I wanted to put on the screen in case you haven't had a chance to read this, and I'm sure we can send out a link to the full white paper afterwards. But the essence of annual giving as a cultivator and long-time support cannot be overstated. It is within this realm that donors are engaged, cultivated, and prepared for their journey toward becoming transformational donors. That, to me, captures the essence of annual giving. It captures the reward that we have, the reason we do this work. There's obviously the short-term payoff. Our institutions and organizations that we work for need immediate revenue. They need support right now. But there's also something so much bigger than that is happening, and that is engaging supporters. It's building a community of people who are passionate about the cause that we represent and who are becoming our long-term group of donors. And yet, despite all of this important work, we are seeing that everyday giving continues to trend downwards and has for several years now. Just a few sort of news clippings, if you like, from the last couple of years. One of the things at the bottom that you can see is from the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. This is their most recent findings. On each of these, like the lowest three tiers of giving, micro, $1 to $100 gifts, small up to $500, and then the mid-size up to $5,000, they're seeing declines in the number of gifts at each of those levels. So that's the question, is this a generosity crisis? Are people giving less? Are people participating less? And many of the things that we're finding is that actually it's not a generosity issue at all. People are certainly giving in different ways, and sometimes that's harder to track. But there's other conditions we need to look at, and that's some of the stuff we're going to talk about as we get started today. So let's look at our agenda. We've talked about the white paper. The next thing we're going to get into is why people give and why they don't give. And then we're going to look at donor experience as the solution, how it feels to be a donor and the new paradigm for donor experience. And then after that, we're going to get into, I think I have 5 different ideas that I really would argue that pretty much any organization could implement somewhat easily. Different resources needed, but not too difficult. Ideas that everyone can do to drive loyalty. That's not a sort of exhaustive list. There's thousands of things you can do to create loyal giving habits, but we're just going to cover some of these. And then we will have time to answer your questions as well. So keep those coming in the Q&A section of this Zoom webinar, and we'll handle those along the way and at the end. So how do we get here? How do we get to a place where donor participation is declining, and it's something that's happened for a long time and sometimes feels like there's nothing we can do about it? And there's certainly some factors here like economic conditions, pressures of increasing production targets. So that has a lot to do with the fundraising models that we've built, this campaign fundraising model, where there is pressure to generate bigger revenue numbers every year. And the easiest way to hit a campaign goal is to get a few very large gifts. Now, that means we're putting more and more attention into those larger gifts. Perhaps we are generating larger dollar numbers in the long run there. But in the short term, we are losing donors because we're not putting as much focus at the lower levels. We are also seeing declines in modeled philanthropy. If one of the sort of things that is related to people's likelihood to give is if they grow up in families that were philanthropic and that were giving. And this even comes down to families attending church and seeing people give each week through their church. We're seeing declines there. So that's another reason that we're seeing these declines in this model philanthropy. It's something that people learn to do, right? And then there's often very short tenures at institutions, organizations, and these causes. Staff turnover is pretty high. And it often takes people maybe 3 years to really get into the swing of the role they have and really build up their program and be successful. And often by that time, people are moving on. So that is also helping us to, or is preventing us, I should say, from really building robust, sustainable fundraising programs. And then the last, but perhaps most important thing when it comes to the base level is that we are seeing declines in institutional trust. This is not just in the nonprofit sector. It really has been born out of the corporate sector, but it's a real problem now. We're seeing less and less trust. Salesforce does a study every year, and if you look for that, or I can send out the link if anybody's interested in it, but it shows that people across all generations have less and less trust in brands and institutions. We did see, we've seen big declines in higher education in particular and in healthcare. Some of this comes down to the politicization of these fields and some of the rhetoric that's out there. But also it comes down to that idea of, do people trust that if they are giving away their hard-earned cash, are you doing the right thing with it and are you using it wisely? The crux of the issue here really lies in not in the absence of generosity, but in the strategic allocation of fundraising efforts. And that's what we were talking about earlier. When we concentrate predominantly on high impact and comprehensive campaigns, like things like principal gifts, these are absolutely vital, of course, but we overlook the foundational role of annual giving and nurturing our future philanthropic leaders. So about a decade ago, BWF started to ask our donors, not our donors, sorry, our clients' donors, what is it like to be a donor? And some of the responses that we heard of the things that we might expect. It's great. I love this organization. I feel like I'm really part of something. These are the things we want, and this is really, really good. But we also heard things like, it's actually kind of lonely. I only hear from them when they want something. And I'm not entirely sure if my gifts matter compared to bigger gifts. This is a problem. It's a big problem because that is the last thing we would ever want a donor to feel. And I think that's probably obvious to everyone here. That's not the kind of experience we're looking to create. And whether or not it's real or not, I think a lot of annual giving people will get defensive pretty quickly when donors say, all you ever do is ask me for money. And we're like, we know that's not true, but perhaps in their perception, it is absolutely the reality. And then therefore it is true in many ways to them. That's how they view us. They view us as always coming out with our hand out, asking for something, always telling them about ourselves. Something I often talk about with clients is if you were meant to meet somebody at an event, like a new neighbor perhaps, and you wanted to network, wanted to make friends, build your circle, you don't go out with your hand out asking for something and saying, let me tell you about myself. Nobody's making any friends that way. You go out and you put your hand out to shake their hand and you ask them, well, tell me about yourself. What do you do? What interests you? That's how you start conversations with people and you get that real engagement. But often as nonprofit organizations and as institutions, we fall into this trap of just telling people all of our talking points, talking about ourselves all the time, not really worrying about if they should care or not, but just saying, like, we've got these talking points, we've got this story to tell, just listen to us. You're going to love it. And they often don't. So why do donors stop giving? This is some research that Adrian Sargent, he's a British academic. This is something that he did, and we've compiled these reasons in the right-hand side, these sort of summaries. Some of these things we can't do anything about. If I can no longer to offer my support, obviously things like death and relocation are problematic. These are external to us. There's nothing we can do about that. You take a lot of these things. My support was not acknowledged. I don't even remember supporting the organization. They didn't inform me how they use my funds, or they don't need my money anymore. I found the communications inappropriate. They didn't account for my wishes. This is stuff that we can manage. We call this donor experience management. These are all things within our control, theoretically. I'm not saying it's easy to do that, but it is stuff that we can manage. And we need to think about that, because if these are the reasons people are telling us that they're stopping to giving at varying different levels, we often are not actually putting much effort at all into managing these things. And in the same vein, why do people keep giving? And it's really the same top driver here. It is donor experience management, where if they perceive that we being effective at trying to achieve our mission. If they know what to expect from us, setting expectations is so important. We'll talk about that, I think, a little bit more later on. Receiving timely thank yous, acknowledgements. Keep saying to people, you cannot overdo this. You can't say thank you too many times, I don't think. And that they receive opportunities to give you some of their feedback, to make their views known, feeling like they're really part of that important cause. Another idea that we'll talk about today is the impact versus community. Oh, I shouldn't really put them as oppositional to each other, impact and community. We've talked for quite a while now about the importance of talking about impact with donors, and I'm not here to tell you that isn't important. I'll be talking about the equal importance of community, and for the base level donors, making them feel like they belong to something, they're part of our group, and they're sort of in our circle. So when we talk about donor experience, one of the ideas that I think is important to get out there is that experience does not equal activity. We're pretty good. Many of the organizations I work with are pretty good at tracking activity. Sometimes we call this engagement. I'm not even sure if that's correct, to be honest, but we often think about engagement as activity. We think about experience as activity. So this could be showing up at an event, could be volunteering their time, it could be opening an email or something like that. That's not what experience is. I like to think of experience as feeling. It's what happens, and that's something that we're not as good at tracking. It's obviously much more difficult to track, but things like, so this donor attends an event. How did they feel when they left the event? Did they leave there feeling like they had learned something new about the organization? Did they leave there thinking, I'm so thankful to be part of this group? Or did they leave there thinking, well, that was a waste of donor money? I hope that's not the case, but I'm sure that happens occasionally. So we need to be thinking about experience as a feeling, which leads to the question, how do donors want to feel when they give to an organization? And the answer, I really believe, comes down to some simple ideas. They want to feel engaged, and that's the key piece here. They want to feel engaged. Whether you think they're engaged or not, they want to feel that they are with organizations they support. So there's three big things. They want to feel that their gift was noticed and appreciated. I have a few tales, sadly, of giving to organizations and never really getting any sort of acknowledgement. One where my wife and I found a stray puppy that we rescued, and there was a local shelter. They didn't have any resources. They had no staff. It was all volunteer driven. And when they helped us rehome the puppy, which was great, and we made a donation to cover this little puppy's like veterinary bills. And we were happy to do that. And they just didn't have any mechanisms to sort of acknowledge that gift, right? It just sort of went through their website, and I think they got it. I don't really know, to be honest, but I'm not picking on the organization because they just had such limited resources to do that work. But that's kind of organization we were feeling pretty strongly about, and we were really appreciative of their work at that time. And just not even having that acknowledgement, like, did they actually get that gift or not? It sort of gets in the way of making additional gifts down the road. And it's noticed and appreciated. They're not the same thing. They're obviously similar, but that feeling, being noticed, is really important. There's lots of things you can do just to make donors feel like, yeah, we saw your gift and we appreciate it. That's sort of step number one. They want to feel that their gift made a difference. I don't think anybody is really looking to donate to an organization that doesn't need their support. At least they don't want to think about it in that way. So obviously that's something we need to illustrate in our communications work. And third, they want to belong to your group. They want to feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. They want to belong to a group of like-minded people. So you can kind of group these things into three different words here: communication, connectedness, and community. I think those three themes are something we should strive for when we're trying to create our donor experience programs and think about the sort of experience we want our donors to have. We want to have great communication with our donors. We want them to feel connected to us, and we want them to belong to our community. And of course, impact is part of that and all of the other steps, but it really comes down to staying in touch with people so that they really, we're maintaining some of their mind share as they get on with their lives. And at the heart of all of this is this simple idea that I've always kept is the first lesson I ever learned in fundraising: the people give to people. That's what it all comes down to. So as we tell our stories about impact, they need to focus on people. As we connect with individuals who are donors and we want to show that appreciation, it's all about people, right? We're going to talk a little bit about marketing automation later on, and that's great. And these are some really good tools that can help us do the work. but we cannot get away from the people element here. This is absolutely critical to fundraising. So something else that we've been doing with our clients is actually measuring engagement through our surveying work. So we have a thing called EngageDX that we do with clients. But what we have found through this work is that the perceived engagement is more important than the observed engagement. So in that observed engagement, a lot of organizations have become better and better over the years at tracking that activity and saying, like, this person showed up to 6 events last year and they made 4 gifts and they also volunteered their time. So they are highly engaged. And if you're developing like an engagement score or something like that, those are probably the drivers of the score. And that's great. But actually, it's not necessarily the same thing as perceived engagement, which is how engaged the donor feels. And what we found is that of those who report those who report feeling engaged, 9 times more likely to be a mid-level donor and 14 times more likely to be a major donor. And actually, if you, in the surveying work, we look at like tracked engagement, observed engagement, and compare that to that perceived engagement and how engaged they tell us. And you see so much mismatch there. People who, live 500 miles away from a university campus, they never show up to anything, but they are reading that magazine every time it comes out, and they'll tell us through the surveying work they feel highly engaged. And the opposite of that as well. We have a person on our team who tells a story about he showed up on his university's like highly engaged list, and he was like, I don't really think about them at all. Like, it's not part of what not part of my daily life. So we have to think more about, are people feeling engaged with the organization, or are they just showing us they are through their behavior? And I would say that donor experience matters because of this feeling affiliation. This is the part which, it's not everyone always agrees with me on this, but I would argue that the feeling of affiliation, that sense of belonging to your community, that is equally or more important than the impact of the gift itself. This does not mean go out tomorrow and stop telling people about the impact of their gifts. It doesn't mean that at all. It means add to that, talk about joining a collective, joining a group of donors, people who are like-minded to the individual, so they feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. If you really want to see evidence of this, some of the wealthiest organizations in the world are those who are the recipient of some of the most philanthropic dollars. It's harder for them to argue they need those dollars as much as some other places, but there are people that just want to be part of those institutions or causes, that it's just part of their identity to belong to that, and that's why they give. So just something to keep in mind there. Let's tell you a little bit more about BWF before we jump to the next section here. We're a comprehensive philanthropic consulting services and technology firm. So if you're new to our community here, we're glad to have you and hope to stay in touch. So we have about 250 clients annually, about 100 employees on the team. And I belong to our engagement and donor experience division, which is really committed to improving the entire donor journey and building for sustainable fundraising programs. So we do a lot of consulting work, we do custom projects. That's what I mentioned earlier, where we're really tackling some really interesting, complex problems for clients. And then we also have a full services arm as well. So we're managing mail and email appeals for clients, all of their digital strategy, really have an agency with an in-house video and creative services team. So they're able to really not just advise clients on the kind of campaigns they should do, but also fulfill them for them as well. And some of our work is kind of encaptured in what we call this new paradigm for donor experience. So something that something that we're showing here is moving away from these ideas of like organization-centric approaches to a more audience-centric approach. One way to think about this is an organization's website. Often you'll find content on the website is actually arranged and organized in terms of the organizational structure of that place. So you might see like pages for annual giving, planned giving, major giving, and there's not a donor out there who's thinking about it that way and who's like looking to find out, like, where's the annual giving section, where's the planned giving section. They want to think about impact, they want to think about opportunities to make a difference. So that's the sort of difference there, moving from that organization-centric model to the audience-centric model. Moving away more and more from static campaigns and siloed planning. There's technology that helps us with responsive journeys with omni-channel campaigns. We always talk about this donor journey and trying to create this journey for donors, and we have to remember that it's not our journey, it's the donor's journey. So we have to be responsive to their needs. There are, marketing automation tools that are out there that help people do this, and that's great if you have the resources to do that. Not all organizations do yet. That stuff will become more and more accessible over time. But even in the meantime, there's a lot we can do to try to respond to our donors' interests and needs, and not just do everything on our schedule when it suits us. And moving away from talking at donors, and just kind of like I am right now in this webinar format, instead of just talking at donors, having conversations with donors. That's really important as well. And then I have another couple notes in there about community impact and also compelling storytelling, which just something that's shouldn't be overlooked is putting the effort into telling compelling stories, and not just taking for granted that they're going to support your organization. Even if they have in the past, we shouldn't just take that for granted. There's a couple questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to address one of them right now from Erin Edwards, which is how does one measure feelings? And I'm going to get to that in a few slides time in a little way, in some way. But one of the ways to do that is simply to ask. That's the only way you can really measure the feelings, is what people tell you. So in the surveying work we do, we actually have somebody on the team who's has a PhD in survey science, I think it is, which is pretty cool. And so he's designed questions that really help to get at that idea with donors to organizations of how do you feel about this and how important is this in your life. So this is the fundraising funnel. If you've ever seen me speak at a conference, or if you're one of our clients, perhaps you've probably seen this before. I use this slide a lot. It's really important. It illustrates one of the most important points to me of how we should be building our annual giving campaigns and our programs over time. It's kind of built off of the sales funnel. It's a pretty common idea in the sales world, where you're basically bringing people in, and as you go through the process, you're going to convert less and less of them to become donors. But in the sort of base level giving world, in annual giving, we spend a lot of time in the middle section of this funnel, that solicitation piece, somewhere in the engagement and donation section. The best way to say this is we are really good at asking people for money. We have our machine-like processes in place to send out appeal after appeal. We have all kinds of models and segmentation work that we're doing, and annual giving teams in particular are really focused on asking people for those gifts, that solicitation piece. What I would argue is that we need to spend more time at the top of the funnel and at the bottom of the funnel. So the top of the funnel, we're getting into this awareness building, and this is one of the things that we see being very different in the sort of higher ed world versus the healthcare world versus the national nonprofit world, because on the national nonprofit side of things, there's sort of an inherent understanding that we need to first tell people about the organization and the impact we're trying to make. I would argue, and this isn't a criticism, it's an observation, on the higher ed side, it's often taken for granted that they know who we are, right? Because we assume, well, they went to school here, so they must know who we are. I think we need to think about philanthropic awareness in that as well. Are they understanding the need to give? Because if you talk to sort of recent graduates from pretty much any school, I think a lot of them will probably tell you like, well, I don't see why they would need my money. I paid tuition, or like they have loads of money, they got a beautiful campus. These are the sort of perceptions that we're fighting against. So that's what's happening in that awareness phase. In the consideration phase, they're starting to see themselves as part of the solution to a problem. That consideration phase is wildly different length of time depending on the size of the gift, is probably the easiest place to see a difference there. The difference between like sometimes people, on like a giving day may be asked to give $25, and that's what they're thinking, and they'll just do that without even thinking about it. We were talking with somebody yesterday about a mid-level giving program. So we're looking at sort of gifts in that $1,000 to $5,000 range with that particular instance. And that's a longer decision-making process. So she actually had donors responding to requests by email, and they would say like, this is really great, really interested in this, but it's not something I can do right now. And we were sort of making the case that that person is actually, I would guess, pretty likely to come back not too far from now and actually make that gift. It just feels like a lot because it's the first time they've been asked to give at that level. So sometimes that consideration phase about when they're deciding to make that gift is going to take a little bit longer. And then at the bottom of the funnel, the loyalty section, this is just, I think, often gets overlooked because of the way teams are structured. And sometimes we think, you know, it's somebody else's job to do that. Some places have donor relations teams, stewardship teams, and we think, well, it's their responsibility to thank the donors. And that's fine. But if your goal is a fundraising goal, if you are responsible for raising a certain amount of money from a certain amount of donors and maintaining a certain level of retention rate, I think you should be caring deeply about what is happening at that loyalty phase of the journey, and if you are actually doing the right things to properly acknowledge your donors and thank them for their support, and talk about impact, talk about community, because that's what's going to be the biggest indicator, or move the needle most in terms of likelihood to make additional gifts down the road, which of course is the easiest way to grow. Also, just wanted to talk a little bit here about expectations for the donor, because I think that's really important. And I also think about the donor experience starts before they make that gift. It's when we think of donor experience, it's not necessarily somebody who's just made a gift and becomes a donor. It is the way that we actually ask them to make that gift, the way we solicit them perhaps, absolutely affects their experience after the gift is made, like how much time they spend thinking about it, and the difference of the different level of gifts, like I mentioned. What were their expectations for you when they thought about making the gift? What did they think would happen versus what actually happened? So the more work we're doing in that solicitation phase, it's fairly obvious with like donor acquisition, but on all levels, I think it's really important to think about that experience really does start before they actually become a donor. So we need to get ahead of ourselves there as well. And that's another reason why I think donor experience is everybody's concern, everybody's problem, something we all need to work on. One of the ideas that I talk about a lot is experience first fundraising. We've referred to this a few different ways over time, but this is all about prioritizing relationships over transaction. It's more attention paid to the top of the funnel that I mentioned, that I showed you earlier, raising awareness for the philanthropic need and finding meaningful ways to connect with donors, and then guiding them towards action while earning their trust. And the thing about this sort of approach is that it may not, generate the most gifts immediately. It may not have the highest ROI in the short term, but it will result in more meaningful philanthropy in the long term. So if you come to us and you say our goal is pipeline, so we want to get as many donors as possible. Well, okay, those two things are not necessarily the same. Let's talk about finding donors who are most likely to have longer term relationships with us, most likely to renew their support and build their support over time. That is pipeline building. And it may mean that you don't always get as many donors right away, but you're finding the ones who are going to truly help you grow as an organization. And how we define ROI as well. I don't have anything about this, I think, in today's presentation, but defining ROI as simply the dollars generated from a single appeal is a recipe for disaster. It is going to lead you down a path of not investing in your base level giving program, and it's going to cause you to make bad decisions about where you spend those resources. You need to think about return on investment as something much more long term, especially if you are pipeline oriented. What is the lifetime value of donors? What is the 5-year or 10-year value of donors? And are we attracting them and finding ways to keep them engaged? Because that's true ROI, right? It's not about what happens, just we send out one appeal and we get these many gifts back. It's about the program we're building in the long run. And just to add a little note there, that engagement can happen in many different forms. For some reason, I think we always just think of events, like engagement, there must be an event of some sort. There's lots of different ways to do that. There's some really cool places doing like virtual and digital experiences. Even just content is really good engagement as well. The more and more people read things, watching videos, especially on like social platforms, these are all different forms of engagement. So how do we measure donor experience? Let's get onto that. I made coffee right before the webinar started and didn't give it time to cool down, so I'm trying to drink it now as I present. I've thought of a few different ways to do this, and there's multiple ways of doing it, but here's a few that I like and that I think are fairly achievable with varying levels of effort. The first would be self-reported. So it's sort of obvious, like the way to measure donor experience and the way to measure feeling is to ask people. In a way, this could be the best measure We also know that it's not always true that people are truthful on their surveys, but it's something that we have to like take with a grain of salt. But ask people how they feel about the organization, or how they, what the experience of giving was like. You can do this in a number of ways. You can do this through pulse surveys that happen periodically for donors, like after they make that gift and in the next sort of 18 months. You can survey the whole population of donors once a year, something like that. And ultimately, you could create like a donor satisfaction score, which would perhaps be the like aggregate of scores, the averages of scores over time. And that one of the keys here in all of these metrics that I'll outline is instead of just measuring, like comparing yourself to others. People always want to do benchmarking, and they say, well, how does this score compare to, XYZ organization score? And I get that that is interesting, but actually I think what's more important is comparing your own scores to your own scores over time and how that's changing. So are you getting better? Are you improving things, or are you getting worse, right? So as we start implementing strategies to improve donor experience, the best way to know if they're successful is by measuring the impact on these sort of things. So whether that's a donor satisfaction score, or the second way, which is giving/loyalty. It is a proxy in many ways for their satisfaction. It's not a perfect measure by any stretch, but the idea would be if a donor is satisfied with the experience they had, they're more likely to give again. There's a lot of nuance to this. There's a lot of situations you can come up with where that's less likely to be true. Perhaps that depends largely on their expectations going into it. There's things like a peer-to-peer fundraising effort's likely to have a much lower renewal rate. So even if that donor was perfectly happy with their experience, they may be fairly unlikely to renew anyway. So it doesn't always work, but I think oftentimes you can think of this as a proxy for were they satisfied with the experience they have. And a quick note on that, most people are measuring retention rates, reactivation rates, acquisition rates. What I advocate for in the retention, actually think of it more as a renewal rate. What percentage of donors make their next gift within 6 months, within 12 months, and within 18 months? If you're really trying to grow and drive that engagement with your donors and really build that pipeline, one of the fastest ways and easiest ways to do that is to reduce the gap between gifts. So not just, we often talk about donor retention's the sort of easiest pathway to growth, but also like decreasing the amount of time between donor gifts so that their average number of gifts per year goes up. I only had to go up just a little bit. It might go from like 1.1 average gifts a year to 1.6 average gifts in a year. But that's a sort of an easy-ish way to increase the overall revenue you're bringing in each year. So I like to look at 6, 12, and 18 months to see how they compare. And these are rolling averages. This isn't like a fiscal year based thing. This is something you should be looking at every single month. And then the third way is through other forms of engagement. This is starts to become quite a big gray area at this point. Thinking about measuring other behaviors. It could be email engagement. Are they opening and click on emails? I really think it's important to look at opt-out rates. And again, I have clients that say, like, is our opt-out rate good or bad? And it's like, well, we can talk about industry averages for sure, but actually what I want to see is what are you doing about it, and are you seeing changes over time? Because there's, again, so much nuance to your own donor file, your own list, that affects the likelihood of people opting out. Like, where did you get those names from? So I really encourage you to like track your opt-out rates and see are they getting better or worse over time. Question in the chat from Karen. At what gift level do you begin to space out solicitations? If I'm understanding correctly, that's a question of like, when do we make that next ask? That is a great question that I think is very sector specific and client specific. The traditional higher ed model is always like once if they give in a fiscal year, don't ask them in. I really think that's something we need to move away from. But at the same time, it's a comfort level issue with a lot in higher ed. So I understand that's something to contend with. We actually just had this exact conversation with a client this morning. I start the conversation typically anywhere from 3 to 6 months. Again, it's not always the answer. It depends on the organization specifically, but we do what I would call like a ramp up to the ask. So spend the first 3 months after their gift really acknowledging it, making them feel special and like their gift was important. And after about 3 months, we make that transition from saying like, thank you, your gift made a difference, to there's still work to do, right? So it's not a direct ask. It becomes a little bit of a sort of awareness building. There's still work that needs to be done. There's still an impact you can make after about 6 months starting that conversation around their next gift. There's a lot of organizations that'll make that next ask in a much shorter time frame. There's evidence out there that you're most likely to get another gift within 90 days of the first gift. And again, it's very sector specific of levels of comfort with that, because a lot of our friends on the higher ed side in particular would be a little nervous about asking within 90 days of the last gift. So I wanted to start closing out today with a few just simple ideas to drive loyalty. I really think most of these things are stuff that you could start to implement, start to look at various different levels. They don't necessarily take a ton of tools to do. They certainly take a bit of effort, but the things that I think are pretty accessible to all types of organizations. The first one is to implement what we call a recognition to renewal journey. It's one of my favorite things to do with clients, which is to build out this sort of workflow of ideas around how to, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Build out these workflows, which can certainly be automated if you have marketing automation software, but they don't necessarily need to be. I often would think about, like I referenced this earlier, those first bit, that little bit of time right after the gift is made. There's a period of intensity, I think, where you can't really have too much communication. They've just raised their hand and made that gift. They want to be part of the organization. So don't just leave them alone and not communicate with them. Make sure they're feeling really special. You can do things like have different principles for showing surprising and delighting them. Maybe that's offering them something in return for their support, not like a give to get campaign, but just something that makes them feel special. Getting really personal through one-to-one notes. Lots of one-to-one video tools can do that. But also that first piece is showing appreciation immediately and more than once, so that they really do feel special. And then over time, over that next sort of 18 months, as we typically would run this for, this one is designed to start asking for that next gift around 9 months, which is a little later than I would, ideally put it. But there's a lot of engagement pieces in there. I would say sometimes people look at this and they think it looks like a lot. So I think it's not enough content. We actually would probably want to see more and more than this, but there's a lot of stuff that's happening in the background as well that's not really referenced on this workflow here. So again, if you have marketing automation tools, that's sort of the easiest way to do some of this work, but you can absolutely do this offline as well, with just a little bit more effort. Number 2 is to create a sense of community, again, because it's just so important. And I just love this example. It's from Charity Water. The language here is just so well written. You belong here. This incredible community is composed of generous, passionate, and determined people like you from more than 100 countries around the world, and they're world changers and history makers, and you're going to fit right in. That kind of messaging that makes people feel like I've just joined an organization that means something to me, that I'm with a group of like-minded individuals. That's a really important thing. And the more you can do that, and it's not always through language, like part of it's just through your messaging and there's a subtlety to it, but there's other ways that I think you can do this as well. How can you connect donors to each other? How can you show them that they're in this group of people? Is there certain experiences you can offer to do that, that make them understand like it's a community that they have joined? Another really simple thing that everybody could do, I often think about like loyalty programs, and we could get way down the road into loyalty programs, and there's a lot of stuff that you could take from those. And I'm not suggesting that, like the Delta one you can see here, I'm not suggesting that the Air Miles programs are necessarily the best ones to create. One of the specific things you see a lot in these loyalty programs, though, is reminding customers of their status. So when you log into the apps, seeing your status listed there, you can see on this one here is a diamond medallion status. Even if you get your boarding pass with Delta and it puts your status on there, when you log into the website, it tells you. I think that's the kind of thing we can do. This is a terrible mock-up I made from a BWF newsletter, but these little dynamic content pieces, ribbons you might call them, going into, like, if you're sending out a newsletter every month, every other month, or whatever it is, put some dynamic content in there so that your donors get called out every single time. You can thank them for their number of years of giving. You could thank them for their cumulative amount of giving over time. You could remind them they're in a certain gift recognition program, like a society or something. And you don't have to do the same thing every single month. But doing this kind of thing, it's just really helpful reminder that they belong to something, and they don't want to lose that status either. So we talk about like rewards sometimes, and sometimes the rewards is just like feeling like they're in your group and they don't want to give that up. They want to make sure they're loyal, you know? And the fourth thing, affiliation and brand ambassadors. You know, this is where you're getting people to feel like it's cool to buy stuff from a certain company because they feel more. You see this a lot with like Apple products. Somebody buys an Apple Mac, I don't know what you call it, a laptop, right? And then they get the iPhone, and then they get the watch, and eventually they become the kind of person who doesn't just use Apple products, but they then get an Apple sticker that they put on their car or on their refrigerator. You see this with a lot of products. I like my Yeti cups, and I also for some reason walk around wearing a Yeti t-shirt, and I have a Yeti sticker on my refrigerator. I don't know why, I just like the brand. At some point you really go from being like a customer of the company to being a brand ambassador for that company, and effectively you become part of the brand itself. So there's things that we can do as organizations just to lean into this a little bit. This should really just, what we really see here is how dirty my wife's truck is, but we can see her University of Central Florida sticker that she's proud to display, and another one that I have from Cincinnati Children's. We're lucky here. We have the #1 children's hospital in the nation here in Cincinnati, and they send out these supporter stickers. So you see these on people's cars around town. It's simple things. They're not super expensive, and it's not anything revolutionary here, but like just little things to remind people that like they're in your group and that they're going around and sort of being proud of that in their communities. And I think this is our last idea for driving loyalty, is retaining mindshare through content. It's kind of hard to explain this one, but in many ways, I would say you just cannot overdo content in this day and age. We do a lot of our content comes to our appeals. And again, thinking back to that funnel, we're really good at asking people for money, and we put a lot of effort into telling really good stories when we are sending somebody a mail or email appeal. We need to put that effort into telling stories throughout time that aren't always about asking people for money. You can see an example here from the Climate Reality Project, one of our clients, that they have this solution circle. This is actually geared towards mid-level donors, but when you join the solution circle, it's not just a gift recognition program. They actually, you can see at the top, like join a training. They offer these trainings for people to learn more about the cause and the things that the Climate Reality Project is doing for that, and really helping to like become part of that organization. But it's all very content driven. The other examples from George Washington University, which is one of our clients, where our first name team has created high volume authentic video, and they are connecting with donors because we often think about like a video. We're going to spend a fortune on a video, and we have a 2-minute video, and then we expect it to like have a shelf life that's a really long time. But actually, if you think about how people engage with social media, we call it trying to stop the scroll. People spend a lot of times on their phones just going through things, and we have a very short amount of time to get their attention. So one beautiful 2-minute video is not necessarily the way to go. We need lots of shorter things, and the way to do that within a good budget is to do it authentically, which actually has higher engagement rates anyway. But we can't underdo that content. We need to be doing this over and over again. And most of the stuff we put out there, people won't see, they'll ignore it, whatever. But if we want to retain that mind share over time, so that when they're ready to give again, they're thinking about us, we need to be constantly reminding them of why we're important in their lives. So in summary, I like to say that your donor experience is the core of your brand, and it represents your values and priorities. It is your culture. And if you've read any Seth Godin books, you'll be familiar with the idea that culture is strategy. He says that culture eats strategy for breakfast, I think. It's something that's really important. If we create an experience where donors feel appreciated, they feel valued, they feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves, they feel like they're making a difference, those donors will be more likely to renew their support. They'll be more likely to go out there and tell their friends about this organization as well. and get their friends to support it. That's how you grow, I think, sustainable fundraising programs and that really drive that pipeline of giving, answering that $500 million question. And that leads to the question, who is responsible for donor experience? Which perhaps is the most important point of the day that I already touched on this a little earlier on, but it is you. Everybody in a development and engagement team is responsible for donor experience. It's definitely not just a donor relations team or the gift administration team that sends out acknowledgements. If you're in higher ed, it's not just the alumni engagement team. It is everybody, and especially those of us who are responsible for bringing in dollars, bringing in donors, getting retention rates, things like that, for sending out appeals, doing one-to-one, mid-level and leadership annual giving type work. We are absolutely as responsible for donor experience as everybody else, and it's on us to do everything we can to ensure that we're creating a good experience for our donors. So with that, I'm happy to answer some questions, and we'll also just make a plug if you want to scan this QR code, or we'll send a link out as well with a survey. We just put one in the chat actually, so that we can get some feedback. Always wanted to hear what you liked, what you didn't like, and it helps us plan future topics for the webinars as well. We have a couple questions, and this one's kind of long, so I'm going to read it as I go. I may or may not be able to answer it, but have you explored the impact that crowdfunding platforms like GoFundMe have had on annual giving, and also what has the role of tax policy played, specifically the changes of deductibility to the standard deduction? Okay, so great question. I think that's two questions. Two really good questions, and there's people that know a lot more about the tax piece than I do. What I think we've seen overall is not a huge impact in support because of the changes to the standard deduction. It was a little bit of I think it was a bit of a myth that people were giving at certain levels just because of the tax deduction. At the major giving level, that's fairly straightforward, fairly obvious that there's a big benefit tax-wise to be had. Frankly, if you're talking about somebody giving $100, whether the standard deduction was what it was a few years ago or what it was now, probably not having a hugely significant impact on their tax burden. But that didn't mean that people didn't think it did, or it didn't mean that they still got into the habit of giving at year end. But what was probably happening more than anything else is that we were driving that idea as a sector, and we were getting this idea in our minds that it's the year end giving season. Everyone gives at the end of the calendar year. So in sort of late November, December, we put a lot more solicitations out there. We do our best work. We save our best creative content until that time. So for many reasons, we get more gifts, right? Which is sort of ironic because it's a time when people are spending a lot of money on other things as well, typically. There's been some really interesting conversation I've seen over the last few months around like summer giving and how a lot of organizations think, well, no one gives in the summer. It's a terrible time. And actually that's because we often just don't ask enough in the summer. So I'm not sure that's entirely answering that question, but I think there's people that have a lot of better understanding of how tax policy really affected things. And in terms of GoFundMe, I touched on this at the very beginning, but it absolutely has had an effect because what has happened is there's new ways for people to actually give to organizations, and they're not all as easy for us to track. And we sometimes don't like that. We like things to be perfectly tracked. In fact, anyone who's sort of an annual giving professional tends to be obsessed with tracking everything. And people are giving in a lot of different ways and giving directly to benefactors and giving through things like GoFundMe. They feel that that's philanthropic. We as nonprofits don't have a way to track that, so we don't like it as much perhaps, but it doesn't mean it's not real. It doesn't mean it's not happening. So I do think that's one of those things that we have to think about in terms of looking at these donor participation declines. That's why we often say like there's not a generosity crisis. People are not becoming less generous. They're giving it oftentimes in different ways. We're also seeing that through donor advice funds as well, where they're not coming through as individual donors, they're coming through other ways. And then to Aaron's question, I think we talked about surveys. So he's asking about landing on surveys, how often and what area. I'm not sure about the what area question, but yes, we should be. You can do this a few different ways. So pulse surveys is something that we can do, like where we would ask, at periods of time throughout, like right after somebody makes a gift, 3 months later, 6 months later, you could do something like that. Or you could get into just once a year type surveys. There's a lot of different ways to do this. And sometimes you hear about like survey fatigue, but I think for the most part, you only get fairly, you might get a 5% return rate on your surveys of response rate. So I don't know that it actually has, it's something we should avoid. I think it's okay to ask people for their feedback a lot of times. And then we have a question here that's a bit of a long one. So let me read it out and see where we can go with this. For staff working on leadership annual gifts and mid-level gifts or larger, what warming strategies do you recommend in addition to personalized videos like from First Name or surveys like from EngageDX when it comes to focusing on the first part of the funnel before solicitation? I'm curious what things should be done before a mid-level gift officer or above asks for a visit or appointment. This is a really good question. And it's tricky, right? Because in a way, it's a fairly straightforward idea, this idea of a warming campaign. If we showed up out of the blue without anybody knowing who we were or why we needed their support, and we just straight up asked for their support, they'd probably be a bit confused and probably ignore us, probably just walk away. It's the challenge is like, how much content do you need and how much time does that take? The second part of that, I don't think can be easily answered. I think everyone's journey is a little bit different and you just don't really know where they're at. The first part is how much content does it take? Probably more than you think, which is one of the reasons like the high volume video is working well, because it's just constantly there. I have a few minutes left, so I'm going to tell you a story that I wasn't going to tell today, but I think it helps to answer this. I went down this rabbit hole a few months ago. I was probably like sitting on my couch and I was scrolling on my phone, and I came across this video that appeared to be really authentic. It was the captain of a cruise ship on I think Celebrity Cruise Lines, and she was giving like a tour of, I think it's like the biggest ship or something. I don't really know. I've always kind of liked boats. I've never been on a cruise, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. So I watched the video, and then of course, you scroll a bit further and you get another video, and she's doing, basically, it turns out it's a daily log, right? So each day she's doing a little video, and she's showing you another part of the ship and how things work. And I found it really interesting. And then I started to realize, like, wow, this is like a whole thing, and she's spending a lot of time making these videos. And there's a lot of them. And I ended up clicking on her profile and watching a whole bunch of them one night. And I eventually realized, like, oh, this is just straight up a marketing tactic, right? This isn't actually authentic. The cruise line is absolutely equipping her with great cameras, probably a crew. She's not doing the production on this herself. She's driving the cruise ship. And you start to realize that it's all a very sort of orchestrated marketing strategy. And it got me really into the idea of cruises. And I started thinking, like, were they trying to recruit me to work on a cruise ship? Well, then, of course, you do that enough, and then you start getting ads to buy a cruise. And really, it's just, I really believe that was just a warming campaign getting me into the idea, because I was absolutely not in the market to go on a cruise. I've got 2 young children that I don't think would do well on a cruise ship right now, but they don't know that. And so I engaged in like a whole bunch of their video content, probably more than most nonprofits could really manage to put out easily, I would say. But that's the kind of volume it takes. So trying to go back to that question a little bit, the volume answer, the easy answer is probably more than we think, and it should probably last longer than we think. What we need to have is a responsive campaign design that when people are ready for us, we take action. So we're constantly learning. And so you can do this really easily inside a social advertising platform, where as people are engaging in the content, you then retarget them with ads that are going more from that awareness building stage into the consideration stage, and then the final step being the engagement piece. I know I've rambled on a little bit. I've probably done enough. I'm so happy to have spent the last hour with you all today, and really appreciate everyone's time, and would love to connect with people on LinkedIn or by email. So please do stay in touch, and we'll let you know what other webinars we have planned in the future. Thank you all for the time today.